What's good, y'all? Hope everybody's well. Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Shout out to Hybrid Ninja, Winston. What's going on? Hope you guys are good. It's going to be a real interesting week, even though it's spring break for those of us here at Fresno State. I will be going down to San Diego Thursday to give a lecture at San Diego State. So shout out to the Africana Studies department. They're going to have me down there to speak. So, anybody in the area who's interested in coming through, y'all know the area better than I do. Reach out, find out, and come check it out. So that'll be this Thursday afternoon, and I'll be not only lecturing, but I'll be meeting with a group of young men on the campus, which I'm really looking forward to. Almost a little bit more than the lecture itself. So anyway, it's been a pretty good day so far. Can't complain. I actually had to go out and run some errands, and I put on a pair of jeans that I haven't worn in a really long time, and I put my belt on to the tightest, the tightest setting it had, and they literally fell off me 3 times. Like I'm walking around with my hands in my pockets holding my pants up. So the weight loss is going fairly well. So that said, in a real relaxed mood, a little bit happy about that. And also, I promised you guys a little while ago, I don't know how many of you remembered, but I said I'd have a little surprise for you. And I do. And so that said, let me share this with you. Some of you who have been on my community tab or in my other social media links will be familiar with this, but the new merchandise is out for the Institute for Black Male Studies. And I will put the link in the chat, but you can see some of the material that's available for some of you who may be interested. And first one, and this was actually done with his permission, Dr. Tommy Curry, founder of Black Male Studies. Have him on a shirt. So you can go ahead and check that out. We got a few shirts and sweaters here that actually say I am a Black masculinist. So even some for the women, the ladies. Got a couple of hats along the same vein, right? So a few things here. Got some tie-dyes that are the same. I'm a Black masculinist. So there's the hoodie, the crop hoodie for the women. That's a smaller size, same logo. And then there's a few others, Black male justice advocate for men and women. Black masculine. I'm a Black masculinist, another design. Black male justice advocate, another design. Yeah. And I got the Asian dude in the profile. That was an accident, but it was kind of funny. So I left it there. So, but then there's also the water bottle. I'm a Black masculinist. So, and if there's any question about what exactly a Black masculinist is, I will put the link for that as well, which you can find on my blog. And if you go to the About page, it gives a clear definition of Black masculinism. So again, that's going in the chat as well. And I'll try to remember to put those in the description box after the video. So for those who are interested, you can explain that if you're so inclined. But go ahead and check out some of the merchandise there. It's the only place you can get it and represent. So support the Institute for Black Male Studies as well as the push for Black men to actually begin to take our thoughts, concerns, reflections, observations, and research to another level. So supported by publicly addressing the channel, publicly addressing the work. But anyway, appreciate that. What's up, Mark? I see you in there. Hybrid, Jay Cleveland, what's going on? And Cozy, hope everybody's well. Southpaw, what's up? T Fitness, what's going on? Got a few brothers in here. Roaring Sun, what's up? Yeah. So shout out to y'all. So let me get out of this. So today, this was a video sent to me by a brother who is dealing with what used to be called domestic violence situation, an intimate partner violence situation. And last week, one of the conversations we had was about protection. And I was saying that Black men have to become have to get used to providing a different type of protection, and that is a protection for ourselves. The way we've been traditionally brought up, most particularly in the 20th century, the ideas around manhood have been to protect and provide, especially as it relates to family and relationships, intimate relationships with women. Um, Protecting ourselves was not one of the aspects of that, but it has gotten to that point where one must. And a great deal of that has to do with the fact that we don't have an unbiased law enforcement kind of situation going on in this country. What we have is an extremely nuanced and baked in idea, or I should say unnuanced, really, and baked in idea of chivalry that is so deeply rooted in our laws and our practices, right? Even when the laws are are neutral, sexually neutral in terms of the way they're written, they're still practiced on a very biased, level. Gynocentrically speaking, we don't punish women for their crimes. 65% less, time as far as sentences are concerned when they commit the same crimes as men. We just don't know how to hold women accountable for their behavior, and it ends up creating a dynamic where men themselves find themselves to be extremely vulnerable. And what that's also kind of manifested in is in an intimate setting. If you have a violent partner, you know, most men have learned to step back. It's really a fairly small percentage of men that will physically get abusive and so on and so forth. Most men step back, and what that's kind of turned into, I would argue, over the last few decades, in some women is a belief that they are the dominant. And what I mean by that is I remember this in undergrad even. I remember women who used to thump their chest and brag about how they talked down men 6'9", and I've actually witnessed that. And I'm thinking, you didn't talk him down. The fact that he didn't want to go to jail putting his hands around your neck is what talked him down. You just were abusive in all kinds of ways, and you took advantage of the fact that law enforcement was more than likely going to be on your side. So men in response have become very hesitant to engage. But what happens when that's abused to the nth degree? What happens when you have no other recourse and you find yourself in a situation with someone that is taking full advantage of the fact that you're a man, taking full advantage of the fact that you're likely going to be called out? And if anything, all she has to say is that she was the victim, even if she knows that she wasn't. And she'll more than likely be believed. And that actually kind of gets worse the bigger, let me just set this real quick, the bigger you might be, right? So that said, I want to introduce you to, he will introduce himself, but this is a YouTube video. I did get permission to play this, but I think it's important that we look at it. And it's about 16 minutes, and I'm going to play the whole thing, but I want you to hear what he has to say, and we'll dialogue about it as we go, dealing with his experience. So here we go.
Hi, my name is Troy. I'm a legal educator in the US and an LSAT tutor, and I wanted to share some thoughts today on the Will Smith incident. So for me, seeing so many people excuse Will Smith's violence has been really disturbing. Partly that's because of my own recent experiences with violence and people excusing it. So I wanted to share my experience to give people hopefully some insight about why violence shouldn't be excused, even female violence, or in this case, unnecessary male violence allegedly on behalf of a female. Now, trust me, I understand the desire to excuse such violence. Personally, I myself have excused such violence in the recent past. For example, when the mother of my child attacked me in late 2019. And I'm going to show you that attack right now on video.
It's hurting me. She's grabbing my neck. I can't get her off of me. She's now lying, but now that I started videotaping, she'll get off.
So right there, you saw the very beginning of the video. I started filming that video about 10 seconds after she had jumped onto my back, and she was choking me, holding my neck. She was also covering my mouth. So people.
Okay, now see, real quick. And first of all, like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you would. Y'all know how to do that. Patreon, you can become a monthly member. YouTube with the super chats, Venmo. Support the channel. Y'all know what it is. But as you can see, He said, about 10 seconds after she jumped on my neck, I started recording. This is one of the examples I was giving about self-protection, right? It's gotten to that point. You can't defend yourself physically without being concerned about what the repercussions may be. Right now, legally, if I'm understanding it properly, you can defend yourself physically if the situation calls for it. But I can tell you, as Black men, even if the situation calls for it, you still have to be concerned about your well-being in terms of how the situation will be interpreted. But I think pulling out your camera, one of the smartest things you can do.
People in the same house couldn't hear me telling her to get off of me, and I started filming because I didn't want to hurt her to get her off of me, but I needed her off of me, and I thought that filming would do the trick, and it did. She got off, as you saw. But what I didn't expect is that she would repeatedly continue to attack me while I continued to film, and I'll show you that now.
I didn't consent to you grabbing my neck and not letting me go and trying to shut my mouth with your hand.
Playing circus.
Yeah, we were playing circus. That's right. Oh, yeah, we're still playing circus, right?
Okay.
I'm not pushing you. You're holding me in the room. I'm opening the door. I'm opening the door. She won't let us out of the room. We'll go out the window. Go ahead, call the police. I'll show them the video. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Too cold outside.
She's gonna be fine.
No jacket.
She's gonna be fine.
No reason for you to take her with you.
She's gonna be fine. Don't worry.
No reason for you
Don't touch my backpack. Don't touch myself. Don't touch me. Get away from me.
That's not okay, Troy.
Get away from me. She just hit me. She's grabbing my nuts. Get off of me. That's what you've been doing for years in our relationship, playing like a victim.
It's not true.
No, it's not true. The video show is true. You've been hurting her and hurting me.
That is not true. I've been playing with her and minding my
What? She's in my arms. She's fine, except for that her mom's physically assaulting her dad in front of her. Okay, so here's what happened just now. I tried to have a reasonable conversation. I said, she said something like, I want to protect Tundra. I said, you can't protect Tundra right now. You're attacking me physically. That's what's making Tundra distressed. You're making Tundra distressed. She said, I didn't try to attack you. I said, oh, video's going back on if you say that. And she said it again, the video's going back on. She didn't try to attack me. She was just grabbing me, putting her hand like this while I tried to speak, hitting me with a shoe, grabbing my testicles, trying to squeeze them, kicking me, jumping on my back, trying to prevent me from leaving, barring the door.
So in these videos, you see that my daughter is emotionally stable at many points, but then every time her mother attacks us or prevents us from leaving, my daughter gets frightened again and starts screaming. And you can even hear my daughter yelling at one point, "Mommy, what are you doing, Mommy?" And I had no idea that her mother would just keep attacking us. I figured that each time would be the last time. I still have no idea why she was attacking us that day. But anyway, let me tell you.
See, this is the importance of video, right? I mean, we know that right now, Chris Brown would probably be incarcerated if he didn't have evidence via texts of his accuser attempting to abuse his star status for personal gain, right? These are the kind of situations we need to be aware of, because these people are very aware of how Black men are perceived, and it can be due to just an immediate a response to the moment, or it can be something that's been strategized over time. Either way, it can cost you your well-being, it can cost you your freedom. In some situations, it can cost you your life. And some of these people know it and don't care, right? But this is the reality of it. You stand at risk of losing everything you may have worked for years. And it could be a complete stranger who just wants to take advantage of a situation. It could be a lover, it could be a wife, it could be anybody. So I want y'all to be careful, but let's continue to watch.
Tell you why I excused that violence at the time. It was because I realized that this woman had herself, according to what she had told me, been, as a child, physically abused, abandoned by her mother, ridiculed relentlessly for her dark skin color and her poverty and other things. And so there was a lot behind that violence, and I knew that. And over the course of the relationship, I learned more and more that there was so much behind her erratic behavior. But what I also learned through almost 5 years of interactions with her, including about 1.5 years of a relationship with her after that attack, is that it is very difficult to help people who are victims of trauma and abuse and who are projecting that abuse onto those they love by actively trying to shield them from the consequences of their actions. What that leads to, in my experience, is just more abuse. And that's exactly what happened in my case. So in May of last year, 2021, this woman, the mother of my child, tried to commit violence against me again, this time through attempting to use the police against me. And what happened was basically around that time, she was insisting that we have more children. And here's a text she sent a few months prior to that.
Yep, keep those texts. So for those of you who may be listening to this, sometimes I have those on the radio that listen. I'll read the text that he has on the screen. There's about 4 text bubbles. The first one on the left says, look at this fun daddy. Injury aside, there's nothing like having fun with daddy. My daddy was supremely important to me. So was my mother. She was most of my world, but my daddy was his own infinitely amazing creature. I'm so happy she has you. And then on the next side, it says also, maybe let's have more babies. I'm 35 and a half. It's probably like urgent-ish. We already know how to get through the first 3 years. Was a rock star astronaut. I guess the name of the baby, I'm not sure. She's laid a really good foundation. Yeah. But another baby in the next year would be good. And I can use the same doctor. Just something I've been thinking about. Pregnancy is a 1-year process plus 3 years for nursing. I'll quit work when I get to the nausea stage at 3 or 4 months. So she's preparing and trying to get him on board with having more children. So he's leaving this up long enough for people to read through, but just wanted to kind of give you.
So when she would tell me that we needed to have more kids, and one time she even told me that she was going to artificially inseminate herself and take our child away if I didn't impregnate her, I would respond by saying to her, look, I would love to have more children, but I need you to be stable for 6 months.
And that's real. I mean, obviously we can say, and not being part of the situation, it's easy to say leave. And it may be very true that he needs to, but it can be very difficult to do in the midst of it. So him even saying I need stability for 6 months, I give him credit for that. That's not hard, not easy to do when you're in a relationship. But usually if you have to tell that to somebody, it's not likely about to happen. But shout out to Steel Rain in the comments. He made he or she, I'm not sure, made a comment that I want to highlight. Steel Rain says, I've seen Black women call police on their boyfriends and husbands because they lost a verbal argument. I told you guys a couple months ago, I had a former student reach out to me and tell me that his best friend got locked back up because his wife was angry that he came home late, right? He was a former prisoner. He's out. He built his own business. He had been out for at least, 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken. She called the police and had him arrested on a false charge because she was angry that he came home late. Right? This is what I mean when I say taking advantage of the dominant perspective on Black men, the perspective that's baked into policy, the perspective that's baked into how Black men are treated, perceived, and engaged, not just by individuals, not just socially, not just in the media, but also by the state. When those kinds of perspectives can be weaponized against you easily, that's a problem, especially when you're dealing with somebody that's willing to use it arbitrarily because they're in a bad mood. That's detrimental. And they don't even if you're the father of their children, if they're still willing to lock you up because of momentary anger, willing to have you lose your business, your job, your status, any of that, just because of momentary anger, what can that do to you long term? Staying with that kind of a person. Some men are literally living in a halfway house, getting out of prison, having to rebuild their lives from scratch, knowing full well that they didn't do anything. One of my favorite YouTubers, good friend of mine, is a victim of this very thing. He has to start his life completely over due to an arbitrary and false accusation that required no evidence to completely destroy his professional life. That is too much power for one gender to have and another gender. I mean, and if you don't think it's a one gender dynamic, Imagine calling the police because you're angry that your wife came home late and telling them that, she beat you up, even if you don't have any bruises, and they need to come get her. How'd that work? Right? But let's continue.
Before I'm going to feel comfortable having more children with you. And I guess she knew when I said that I was no longer going to let her control our relationship with violence and threats of taking my child away. So beginning actually in April of 2021, she started trying to provoke me into committing an act of violence against her. And so after about a month of her just starting these bizarre conversations and then trying to escalate everything constantly, finally I was like, if you want to talk to me, it's got to be on film, because I was hoping to deter her from violence again and create a record of what was actually happening. Because at this point, I knew that she had delusions, or she was a compulsive liar, or both, probably both. So anyway, by May 2nd, she realized that she wasn't going to be able to provoke me. And so she just called the police on me for no reason whatsoever. And she abducted our daughter right after they arrived. And she took our daughter to a domestic violence shelter, I presume to try to justify her essentially kidnapping. And here's a little clip from her calling the police.
See.
What are you calling the police for? You can literally just leave right now. I just told you I could pack. Hey guys.
So, man.
You want to come in or what?
Yeah.
Sure.
Where's your wife?
She's in the bathroom.
Do you have any weapons? Do you lift your?
Dude, I don't have any weapons.
I just gotta make sure.
I know.
Can you just wait over here with my partner?
Sure.
What's gonna be the plan?
That's what I said to the police officer. I said, Miss, you could send the police over here, but what's going to happen? I already offered to leave.
Yeah.
She already was going on a walk. She said, can you guys separate? I said, she was already going on a walk. I didn't stop her going on a walk. And I was packing.
By the way, I should mention that you don't have to take my word for it that I never abused her. And you don't even have to rely on these videos I'm showing you. That's because a month after she left and had a whole month of trying to use depriving me of my kid to rope me back into the relationship, she filed a domestic violence restraining order against me when I was not going to get back into the relationship with her. And that order, if granted, would have prevented me from seeing my daughter at all. And she lost that case. And she asked the judge to reconsider his decision, and she lost that too. And this was not a judge who liked me, by the way. In fact, my ex presented her case first.
Now that's real, and this is something that I remember saying about Nate Parker back in the day. Right around the time he came out with Birth of a Nation, everybody was calling him a rapist and all these various things for a case that took place in the 1990s when he was a college student. Yet a jury of all whites except for one person found him to be innocent, and there's no love for black men. So what does it take for a black man who's accused of rape, raping a white woman, to be found innocent by a jury of white folk? How innocent do you have to be for that judgment, and yet to still be dismissively called these negative terms and so on and so forth is profound. So when this gentleman here talks about her losing 2 cases having to do with this, request for a restraining order, that's a big deal. Because as a black male, he's not walking in with any type of assumed support. That's not the narrative. So he has to be that much more prepared and more than likely innocent for him to get over and off that kind of thing. So I just wanted to kind of point that out real quick. He's not walking in with the benefit of court assumption.
And the judge listened to hours and hours of her lying. And then he stopped everything. He took both our lawyers behind the courtroom into his chambers, and he told them that he'd seen enough, he'd heard enough, and he was ready to issue a restraining order against me before I had even gotten the chance to say a word. I had not presented any defense whatsoever. And my lawyer told me, hey, you're getting railroaded here, but you might want to settle. And I basically said, we're not going to do that. I am confident that the evidence will be able to sway even a mildly reasonable person. And so I went forward with, and I won, and I thought I was going to win because, she had no evidence because I had never abused her. And there was tons of evidence that showed that her whole story was a lie. And part of that evidence, for example, was that just a few days, 3 days before our separation, she said that she would be totally fine with our daughter splitting time evenly between us.
Wow.
Yet,
Wow.
in the case, she said I was some monster who couldn't be trusted with our daughter and blah, blah.
Notice how easily the monster defense comes up, how quickly Black males can be repositioned and reframed as monsters when convenient. Notice how easily that can happen, right? And how much he had to go through in order to fight an accusation that should have been baseless at the point that it had no evidence from the beginning. But the other thing I want to point out is if you're looking through the live chat, right, brothers are talking about their experiences with abuse. And it's funny, when I put the details out on a community tab, I put it on all over my social media about various data related to Black males suffering from intimate partner violence. I get all kind of pushback about how this isn't I even put information on Black men being raped in prison. And I get other Black men that want to debate. No, this doesn't happen because it didn't happen in the jail I went to. No, abuse doesn't take place because I haven't seen it. But you have brothers in the live chat right now that are actually telling you, this looks like my wife, my ex-wife. This looks like my ex-girlfriend. This looks like what I grew up seeing with my mother, right? And yet and still, when it comes down to actually having discussions about Black male vulnerability, all of a sudden everybody gets amnesia. It's real interesting.
Blah, blah. And here's the video of her saying that she's totally fine with splitting time evenly 3 days before our separation.
Wow.
I'm okay with 50-50 here in the same state if we're nearby each other.
Okay, so I'm in Venice, or you're in Westwood. She stays over with me on Sunday night, and then Monday she goes with you, and she stays over with you on Monday, and Tuesday she stays with me, and
Yeah.
Tuesday night.
That's
You want to do that?
50-50. Yes.
You want to do that?
Sounds like 50-50.
Yeah, the evidence speaks for itself. And there was so much more evidence. And it was very clear that she was just perjuring herself over and over on the stand.
Receipts.
I don't have time to get into all that evidence now. Instead, I want to focus on how the excuse of her violence led to further abuse. So I already told you about the abusive litigation I had to endure. I've spent over $70,000 in the last year fighting this fraudulent case. Meanwhile, she's not even paying rent because she's living with these enabling white millionaires who I guess are trying to like steal my daughter, have a granddaughter of their own. I don't know. And then on top of all the money I spent, there's been all the trauma I've had to endure combing through this evidence over and over. 5 years of evidence, 5 years of my mistreatment and abuse at her hands. And I've had major trouble sleeping. I've lost so many hours of work. And then on top of all that, there's the effects on my daughter.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen my daughter in almost a year. And I have videos of me FaceTiming with my daughter after her mother finally allowed us to FaceTime. And in these videos, my daughter is weeping and screaming and begging her mother to be allowed to see me.
Wow.
It's really sad. And even one time my daughter started trying to like bargain with her kidnapper. She started offering kisses to her mother if her mother would only let her see me.
Wow.
It was kind of sickening to watch, actually.
When a child has to start bargaining with their mother to have the opportunity to see their father. Now, it may not have been a matter of trading kisses, but I suspect there are far too many of you that understand that dynamic on one level or another. And for some of us, we didn't understand it until we became grown men. A lot of us had a lot of friends, I'm Generation X. Mine was the generation, in hip hop that said our fathers weren't shit. We made songs about how horrible they were, right? At least until you hit manhood. And if you actually step back and you looked at the behavior of those you were in relationships with, the casual accusations, the use of family court, the abuse of it, really, then you started to kind of draw some connections some of the time. And you figured out that, you know what? There's more to this going on. And I told you guys this over a year ago, probably more like a year and a half to 2 years ago. If you've never met your father or you've never had the conversation, sit down, ask questions, and actually listen. Because from the 70s on, or most particularly the 60s, but especially in the 70s onward, Men were going through something, they were hit with something they didn't understand. And that hasn't changed. This is why the marriage rates have continued to drop since the 70s. They've gotten lower, most particularly in regard to men walking away from formal marriage. Well, this is not because of laziness. This is not because men don't appreciate family. Those are all feminist tropes and mischaracterizations, most particularly of Black men. It was a very strategic and logical withdrawal from a situation that was fairly unbeatable. Now, you can tell me that you're alpha enough to thump your chest and make sure that no woman will do X, Y, and Z to you. But what we found, structurally speaking, is that 1 out of 2 marriages ended in divorce. Women initiated 70, 80% of those divorces. This is beyond the individual machismo of a given man. This is structural, and it's based on the access to resources, access to policy, and access to a family court that is bent in the interest of women. So men responded by withdrawing from marriage as a protective gesture, especially when you may have even been in a situation where you're having kids that you never wanted. You may have articulated that you didn't want kids. You know how many men have reached out to me to tell me about punctured condoms, lies being told about birth control being taken, all of those kind of dynamics. And of course, other men just say, well, you were dumb enough to believe her. But when you've been with a woman for a couple of years and you think y'all are on solid ground, that manipulation is real. It can be real, especially if she's really at a time in her life where she wants a child. Whether she tells you about it or not, she has complete control over her system. 5 major types of birth control in over 35 different forms. And that doesn't include abortion. She can control that before, during, and after the sex act. You got a piece of rubber. And we act like that's infallible. But the point I'm getting at is simply that Black men knew they had very few supporters, they had very few people in their corner, and very few opportunities for redress. So one of the major methods of dealing with this changing environment that saw men as the basis of all, people's the bane of everybody's existence, most particularly Black men, was to take a step back. They still engaged in relationships, but they were more strategic on what terms. And I'm not saying that those men did it perfectly by any measure, but they were responding to the times and ways that they didn't. It's only now that we have 50 years to step back and look at this, and we can compare notes as men because we have free access to social media. There are no formal Black men's studies department. I have one that's online. Tommy Curry has one that's in Edinburgh. And then there's a Black Male Research Center, I think, at Morehouse. But there was no opportunity for us to analyze this and compare notes on a wide scale. Women have had that opportunity for over 40 years. Men have not. So we're trying to figure this out. But in the time period in question, men just took a step back from formal marriage because alimony, divorce, child support, all of that stuff was extremely dangerous, especially for men with inconsistent access to employment. That became extremely dangerous. So now we're reevaluating with a different opportunity to communicate with one another and share data, research, and experiences. And so we can actually step back and understand our fathers differently if we're willing to do the work. And you might discover that your father is a human being. And were you in the same situation, you may not have done exactly what he did, but you might understand. Because there were changes taking place on a macro level that nobody was stating out loud. And men just had to deal with it. So let's continue.
And this trauma to my daughter could have and should have all been prevented by the California court system. See, there's this law in California that says that a judge cannot overlook physical domestic violence and give custody of a child to a physically abusive parent. I mean, they can if they make really detailed findings about how that would be appropriate in a specific case. But basically, the state legislature of California passed this law telling judges, hey, stop ignoring domestic violence. This is not good for kids. The people who do domestic violence shouldn't be with these kids. So anyway, I showed the video of this attack to our judge, and my ex didn't even attempt to explain what was happening in that video when, for example, she pulled me away from the window, knocking me and my daughter into a dresser, and then she proceeds to hit me as I retreat into the bathroom.
We're gonna be fine. Don't worry.
No reason for you
Don't
to
touch my backpack. Don't touch my stuff. Don't touch me.
leave
Get away
her.
from me.
That's not okay, Troy.
Get away from me, Sarah.
And nor did she even attempt to explain what she was doing when she was ducking down and into me, trying to squeeze my testicles once I was in the bathroom.
She's grabbing my nuts.
But despite this clear video, and despite the obviously false testimony she was giving about this video, which was full of holes and which the judge even determined was false, and despite this clear California law that if you're going to give custody to an abuser, you have to have these specific findings, the judge gave custody to her mother without doing any other findings. And then he put these absolutely ridiculous restrictions on my visitation rights. And then many months later, a new judge had to review those restrictions, and he didn't even let me speak at the hearing about my daughter's future. And that was, in my opinion, a gross violation of my state and federal constitutional rights, because there's this little constitutional right everyone has called due process, and it basically guarantees everyone at least the right to be heard in an official proceeding about you when those proceedings could have a direct and significant impact on your life. And that's not even to mention the rights of a parent, the rights of a child to see one another without arbitrary interference from the government. But yeah, so judges in my case just chose to ignore the law so that they could ignore female violence. And that has been damaging myself and my daughter ever since. And then on top of that, my ex has now been allowed to sink even deeper into this totally abusive, deceitful, and violent personality, which can't be good for her either. And
now that's we have to deal with this. Now, first, let me say, I don't know where, because people always go off into the all argument. I am in no way suggesting that this is all women. I'm not suggesting this is all relationships. What I am suggesting is I've shown the data. Black males are actually the most abused demographic across race and gender. That's first and foremost. Secondly, if there are no checks and balances against negative behavior, there's no reason or incentive for it to stop. If women aren't going to be sentenced, they're not going to do the jail time, they're not inclined to stop. That's human nature. That is what it is. So you have to prepare yourself, brothers, for not being supported. Shout out to Dr. CD2. Shout out to Egbert Field. Appreciate that support. Appreciate the compliment. Shout out to Apolio. Says, I can't do it. I'm too crazy for this to happen to me. I'm glad that I'm single-ish with no kids. And you got to know those limits too. You got to know your own limits. Because I'm going to tell you, when I was a kid, and this is, I know this as a kid, and I'm mindful of it now. When I was a kid, when I would get into fights, which was a lot, because I was angry about my family my mother and father having a divorce when I was 5. When I met my stepmother, I didn't understand. I just, saw this woman walking down my father's hallway one day. I didn't know who she was, and I didn't understand what was going on. So I had a lot of rage as a kid. I was in a lot of fights. But what would happen is, I went to a predominantly white public school. So there were a lot of the fights were about race. And all I remember is I would black out at the height of the back and forth. I would black out. The next thing I know, I'd be sitting in the principal's office, and they would be calling the hospital for something I did to some kid. I didn't remember what I did. I'm just straight Bruce Banner style. I just would black out. Not the best thing if you know anything about trained hand-to-hand combat, but when you're a kid, you're talking about kindergarten through 6th or 7th grade, you can do a lot of damage. And I did. A lot of pent up rage, straight up. But a lot of that was in response to, situations I didn't know how to deal with. Now, fast forward to adulthood. I avoid, especially with women, situations that can get crazy. Because if I black out, I don't know what I'll come to. And this has actually happened to a lot of men. See, because when we talk about abuse, we start the discussion at men's response. We ignore everything prior. Matter of fact, to even bring up what may have happened prior is considered blaming the victim. So it's considered uncouth, therefore you don't do it. But it's more and can be more than just a casual argument. She can actually be physically abusive herself. It can actually start from a need of self-defense and go much further. What we know about the data is women tend to strike first. They tend to use weapons to a greater degree. Men tend to use their own hands. So women strike first. Men create visible damage. Women tend to use weapons. Men use their own hands. And if it goes too far, you can black out and end up finding yourself in a situation that may cost you the rest of your life sitting in a cell. So I'm a huge advocate of getting up and leaving. If you need to do that, you need to know yourself. And that's the whole reason I brought up me blacking out as a kid. You have to know yourself. If you know you have limits that you just don't want to test, you've seen in the past when those limits, what happens when you go past that, you need to know what you are capable of. If you don't know what you're capable of, not some shit you want to find out in the moment. I remember one kid was messing with my little sister. I blacked out. Next thing I know, they were taking him away in an ambulance, and I saw him in a cast for the next 6 weeks. I didn't know how to process that in the 4th grade, 5th grade, whenever that happened, but I do not want to wake up in my 40s heading to a cell because I blacked out. So whatever your limits are, be mindful of it when you're dealing with people that are using situations against you simply because they can.
People in authority could have stepped up to the plate and done something, and instead they chose to participate in child and spousal abuse. And the fact that our court system is this corrupted just shows the importance of non-governmental actors standing up to violence. So individuals, businesses, professions, associations, nonprofits, we all have to stand up to acts of violence, condemn them, try to eliminate them from our society. And we don't necessarily need criminal consequences for every act of violence, but there have to be consequences. And perpetrators of violence have to themselves step up to the plate if there are going to be viable, non-criminal ways of responding to violence. Perpetrators will have to take serious, substantive actions to make amends for their violence in some tangible way. So Will Smith now is one of those people. He should be coming forward and taking meaningful action to reduce violence, not just apologizing for it. Anyway, I hope this story about my own abuse and the abuse of my daughter, which is ongoing, helps you understand the importance of not overlooking female violence and unnecessary male violence justified by some misguided ideas about how to protect women. And I hope that some social, political, and judicial changes to our society can result from this incident, from the video I'm sharing, from all the things that are happening in the world where people are standing up to violence and aggression. Thanks for listening.
Okay. So shout out to him, right, for having the courage to not only record, but also share that, right? I'll share his channel. I'll share the video in the description once the video's done. He's known as Law School Guru, right? So he, dealt with the situation the best he could. I hope he has found some measure of peace. He did mention he hadn't seen his child in over a year. So I hope he's been able to see the child, and I hope that he has not returned to that relationship. And this is partly, an issue that I think Black men are particularly sensitive to, right? Wanting to right the wrongs of our fathers, right? Wanting to be better men than our fathers were, wanting to marry and have families until death. And sometimes that can be used against you. You can have someone that exploits your desire for family by abusing you and making it a point to test your mettle and keep you from leaving. It's a control mechanism that some people are willing to employ. And again, this is not to suggest that all women do this, but it's a piece of the discussion that we don't have, because any piece of the discussion that highlights men as vulnerable is considered bad faith. It's considered, we're not supposed to take that tact. We're not supposed to look at it from that vantage point. We run with the white feminist narrative that patriarchy is oppressive to all women. We don't actually acclimate and adapt or address the particularities of those arguments to different communities. The Black community is not the white community. Patriarchy does not function in the Black community anywhere near like it functions in others. for better or for worse. Not even putting a judgment on it. I'm just simply saying it doesn't. So these kinds of arguments that villainize men are highly problematic. But let's look at the response. Now, this is not a response to this particular the video I just played. The video I'm about to play is not necessarily a response to that video, but it does give us a clue about how men are perceived from the vantage point of professional therapists, right? So let me go ahead and share this with you. I was just sent this today. Found it interesting. Tell me what you think.
Hi. So here's this thing that I've noticed. So I'm a therapist, licensed psychologist. I work with women, primarily Black women, and I work with a handful of couples. Couple revelations. I haven't seen any of my couples this week. And I realized that my energy at the end of the week was different, notably different. And I connected it to the fact that it's because I'm not seeing the couples. And the couples that I'm currently working with are all heterosexual couples.
Wait for it.
And the emotional labor for me to see the men in the relationship as full, whole human beings who are deserving of love and empathy is sometimes overwhelming.
Now, just to unpack some of that word salad, she's having difficulty seeing men as human. She's having an extremely difficult time seeing men as human beings worthy of love and empathy. Just wanted to be clear about that because the word salad might come across as a little confusing on first listen, but let's continue.
Because of the way that I see them engage with their women partners and the way that I see the women partners overcompensate for their male partners' lack of empathy.
Right. So she only sees this one way. Now, I can tell you this from personal experience, being married, going to a marital counselor. I can talk to you about scores of men who have dealt with this. We can look at Dr. Tommy Curry's book, The Man Knot, and its assessment of the Duluth model and the impact on psychology as a field, especially in regard to therapy, to the extent that there's a central idea inculcated in many different approaches that deal with coupling, that women are inherently the vantage point that we begin the discussion on. Their safety, their perspective, their feelings, their worldview are prioritized, and men just consistently disrupt this by being unfeeling, uncaring, lacking empathy, right? And I'll give you some thoughts as to what I think she's doing here, but just to kind of put this in context, and so many men have talked about their experiences with relationship counseling, marriage, especially, well, I should say, even when they've sometimes found male counselors, which is not the easiest thing to do, by the way, right? You deal with marriage counseling, the majority of those who practice that tend to be female. And overwhelmingly, men talk about going into these sessions and being deprioritized. If anything, it becomes a finger wagging session using academic terms, right? To justify her feelings and perspective and invalidate men's. Simplistic, granted, but reoccurring, absolutely, right? Most men feel like, or many men, I should say, don't feel like they actually have a supporter in the room. I mean, my situation was so bad, even my wife was like, yo, she is really biased. You know what it takes for your wife to look at you and say, you know what, she's really biased against men? Yeah. I've talked to scores of men that have had these issues. And here's the thing. Sometimes you get browbeaten into it to such a degree that some men accept it and spend the rest of their time browbeating themselves because this is what they're modeled in these sessions and told that they're supposed to do. Hell, if you watch the clip with Will and Jada, where Jada is putting the camera in Will's face and asking if the marital counselor they have has helped them, right? Nothing in that dynamic suggested that Will was represented. If anything, Jada was way too comfortable. She had no self-accountability whatsoever. When he told her in a very calm fashion, please don't put the camera in my face. My social media is my bread and butter, all that jazz. And she just dismissed it. I'm not going to play the video here, but many of you may have seen it. You can look for it and you'll find it pretty readily. after the slap. It's all over social media. She had no self-introspection about her behavior at all. None. And when you've been working with a therapist that is forcing each person to be introspective about what they bring to the relationship, if you're not the first one to do it in terms of examining your own behavior, your partner may remind you very gently what you're not doing. But if that training hasn't been there, it doesn't come up. And just from their exchange, it did not look like introspection was a part of their dynamic, especially as it related to her. It looked at like introspection was only a part of the dynamic as it related to him, not as it related to her. So let's continue.
Lack of compassion, lack of emotional intelligence, lack of responsiveness, lack of accountability. It's exhausting. Women who are in loving, intimate relationships with cishet men are doing a lot of emotional labor in a.
Now you see why. And shout out to Solus for the support. Also, shout out to David. Appreciate that support as well. Make sure you guys like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel. 284 watching. Please make sure you share the video, hit the like button. Y'all know the deal. This is why I created the concept of male relationship emotional labor. And if you're not familiar, I have a couple of videos where I talk about it. You can go back to those and look at it. But the reason I created the concept is the very concept of emotional labor is one that's generally perceived to be something that only women do. And part of that is because they've defined emotion and labor strictly in terms of women's experiences and worldviews. So from that vantage point, men don't do that. It's kind of like, if you go back several hundred years, right, and Europeans were asking the question, well, who else on the earth has built civilization? They weren't talking about some generic idea of civilization. They were basically talking about European civilization. So who else built European civilization? Nobody but Europeans. Ergo, anything else, no matter how advanced, if it isn't European civilization, it's not civilization. Therefore, everybody else is less than. See, it's a disingenuous question. In the same fashion, who else does emotional labor? Well, how are we going to define emotional labor? Well, we're strictly going to define it based on how women define it. Well, then that means men don't do it. Similar to the concept of rape. You guys know in 2012, I've talked about this. The FBI redefined rape. Used to be defined in accordance to, and this is paraphrasing, but the kind of violation of a woman's body, right? The new definition post 2012 removes gender and talks about penetration, talks about, and from that vantage point, you can actually have more people included in the definition of having been sexually violated. But as long as the definition of rape is the sexual violation of a woman's body, well, who's committing it and who's on the receiving end? See, the definition is key. So I brought in a definition of emotional labor that's specific to how men experience it, tied to our training, our social training to protect and provide. See, in a very short period of time, we went from being socially expected to protect and provide. And then really in the 70s and 80s, all of a sudden we were supposed to be emotionally present. And there was no transitional training that went from protect and provide to emotional presence, but it was an expectation. And men were judged on how well or how poorly they performed it. But nobody talked about the fact that that wasn't part of our training. And it hasn't been. For centuries, it was about protecting and provisioning. So now it's a new expectation, and you have men trying to adapt to it and figure it out and make sure they practice it, and again, I want to keep going back to Willa Jada, but as dysfunctional as that was, there was a lot of that confusion there, even in that situation. How exactly do men provide this type of emotional presence that we've not been trained to do? And for the most part, people define it against how women perform it. And so you're bound to pretty much fail unless you change the definition to actually suit, just like we did with rape, to actually suit the experiences of those who aren't women. And when you actually include men's experiences and open up the definition to what types of emotional labor men perform, then you can have a different model to function from. What she's doing in this analysis is she's saying that men are poor at this. They're dropping the ball. They're in essence, what she's saying is they're not women. That's what she's saying. They're doing a horrible job of meeting the standard of emotional intelligence and emotional labor based on how we as women define it. Cishet men. Notice she said that. not gay men, not trans men or trans women, just cishet men. So somehow everybody else has got this magical inoculation except for cishet men that cannot emulate women. And if you look at the LGBT community and of course women themselves, one of the things they tend to have in common, and this is a general, generic statement, but they tend to have a very high appreciation of Black femininity in the Black community, most particularly, to the degree that they're emulating it, they're pedestalizing it, so on and so forth. But you'll find the more masculine the man is, the more derided he is for not acting in a manner that women approve of. In other words, not acting like her, not even aspiring to act like her. Even when she talks about the tasks around the house that men do, this was debunked back in the 1980s. Go back and look at Warren Farrell's Myth of Male Power. And he talked about how the studies that came out about the whole second job that women did when they came home, cooking and cleaning, and how men just kicked their feet up and watched the game was bullshit. He pointed, it was bullshit in the 80s, and it still is, because men actually performed different types of house labors. They just didn't do the same thing. But women defined it because it was politically expedient to do so. They defined it against how women define the second shift at home, not in terms of what men actually do. And I recently put up some data about that a couple months ago. I might try and mine it out and put it back up for you guys. And I actually did a show on it about a month ago, I want to say maybe, that dealt with this whole question of men's labor at the house. But watch her double down into this.
In addition to a lot of additional domestic labor, especially if there's a marriage and households, the math ain't mathing in these relationships. And sometimes the responsibility for me as a therapist to be objective and to hold the space of serving the couple is effort.
Yes.
Because I really, really want to talk to the men.
Exactly. And a lot of it is effort, because if you've been trained, especially in women and gender studies, you've been trained in feminism, and you don't have to be limited to women and gender studies to be inundated with these kinds of Black feminist ideas. The only vantage point you do develop, even if you're a man, even if you're a heterosexual man taking these classes, and I've seen these young men, right, leaving with a healthy dose of hostility for other men. Why? Because the only vantage point they've been taught to use to look at men is one of criticism and negativity. And I'm saying this as someone who did it. I wrote a book to get tenure. This was right around the time my wife passed, so I was a basket case, and I had to write this book to get my tenure. Much of the time, I wrote it on my iPad at the park when my son would be playing every day. And, I'm a single father. It was, very quickly it occurred. My wife died. She got sick, died 2 days later. It was all of a sudden took me off guard. And so I had to write this book, and I had to get it in, and I did. And I wrote it on hip hop. And I still use it when I teach hip hop. It's okay for that. But if you ever get hold of it, it's a very thin book. One of the things you'll notice is there's a point toward the end of the book where I pulled some material out of my dissertation that dealt with gender in regard to representation in hip hop. And one of the things you'll notice is there are 2 sections on Black women. And the section on Black men is like a page. I realized after I finished my doctorate, outside of the negative critiques that were fairly common in Black feminist analyses of men, I had nothing to say about Black manhood. The only way I was trained to look at Black manhood was through a lens of what problems men created for everybody else. That was the only lens given. So if you're in a school system where over 90% of your teachers are female, and then you go to college and the majority of your professors are female and feminists, and I should say that about the K through 12 ones as well, and the same for graduate school, what you end up with is an overindulgence in feminism as truth. And there's no pushback. As a matter of fact, if you find pushback, you might be punished. This is why I tell young men who are going for their graduate degrees and they come to me and ask for help, you got to be very strategic in how you use some of the stuff you hear on YouTube, some of the stuff you hear even in Black male studies. You have to be very politically strategic, because you might actually have people on your committee, male or female, who identify as feminists and see any pushback toward feminism to be an inherent negative gesture, an inherently misogynist gesture, because you push back, question, or God forbid, provided data that disproved some of the comfortable arguments that are made in these spaces. So you have to be extremely strategic when you navigate this terrain. Shout out to Circle of Pharaohs for the support. Shout out to Ghetto User. What's going on? Appreciate that. The Kobe 42. Appreciate that support. Let's continue with the last portion.
And help build the men's emotional intelligence and the men's capacity for emotional discomfort and the men's.
In other words, promote your ability to identify with her feelings and worldview and take that as the primary basis to establish yours. In order, you have to cater to her, you have to give to her, you have to make sure that you don't upset her, that you don't go against her wishes. And to do so is to get patted on the head. You've now become a good Black man.
Ability to regulate the.
Okay, that's where it ended. Right. And I was glad it ended because it was ridiculous. But these are the kind of issues that come with these things. So I played the first video for you where you got to see this man abused. And I just have a question. In the second interview or the second video where you got to see this therapist, and she got all kinds of support on her page from other Black female therapists, most particularly, right? Did you hear her in any way address the kind of men that you saw in the first video? She didn't even address the possibility. And how many of those men exist? I mean, keep in mind, fellas, there was a campaign from the late 1960s all the way through the 70s and 80s and 90s and to this day. There's a campaign. There are whole television channels around highlighting female victimization and what are the myriad ways that informs that it takes. Women being chased down alleys by men with knives, husbands that turn out to be Dr. Doom who are plotting their wives' deaths and have been doing so for 20 years. And he said he loved her, and all kinds of stories and movies and television shows, framed around male violence, male villainization, male criminality, male just monstrousness, right? When I ask Black men to think about how many stories in popular media they can come up with that highlight victimization of men at the hands of women, males, I should say, at the hands of females, the discussion generally doesn't get too much past, what's it called? I want to say Andre Fisher, but that's not the right name. What's the right name of the movie? With Derek Luke, Antoine Fisher. As far as we go. Film from the 90s, right? You guys come up with a couple more, please add them in, but you're not going to find anywhere near as many. We have not been trained to identify male victimization the way we have female victimization. But this is what makes the data that much more striking, because men who have not been trained to identify their own victimization as victimization are still coming forward with enough reports that highlight that the rates of victimization for men are actually higher than they are for women. And you can go back and look at the video where I talked about that in depth. Matter of fact, I might remember to include it in the description. If I don't, remind me in the comments and I will put the link in there for that video too, where I go through that data. But the point I'm getting at is the data is still showing that enough men have come forward about these experiences for it to top even women. And yet men have not been trained to understand what I mean by that. If you grew up watching film after movie, after show, after comic book, after literature text, after classroom assignment, covering the various ways that men are victimized, how much more would you see? See, there's no legacy of 40 years of a Black male studies department or a male studies department where you study this stuff in depth. You don't have that. Most men that come into these spaces or listen to my videos are often coming to grips with experiences that they did not have a vocabulary to explain, but they readily identify. And this is not limited to my spaces like this. Again, I'm gonna go back to Warren Farrell. If you go pick up Myth of Male Power, the original version, one of the things he says in the intro, it might even be in the preface, I can't remember which, but he says it very early on in the text. He says, look, ladies, if you're reading this book with your boyfriends or your husbands, your male significant others, be prepared for moments where they're going to jump up and shout. right? They're going to jump up. They're going to get excited. Don't be intimidated by this. Don't be upset. Don't be surprised. They're not being violent. It's just that they've never heard their situations explained before. Now, this was written in the early 80s. And when I read the book, I was still asking questions about men and what we were experiencing. And I had the very reactions he said I would. And this was a book from the 80s. And this is still occurring. That's why men are going through this awakening and this period of rage, because you go through your whole life being told one thing, kind of noticing something's different, but you don't know how to put your finger on it. And whenever you try to speak up, people tell you that your response is crude, or the other men who are saying the things that you're kind of feeling, they're too crude, they're too rude, they're the language is just too foul. It's just, well, they haven't had 40 years to refine it with institutional support. What you got is a free platform in social media where brothers from all over are just spitting it out with no refinement because it's raw. It's almost like vomit. We haven't had 40 to 50 years of institutional support, endless grants, educational programs, papers, conferences, right? We just came through Women's History Month. All kinds of examples of resources being brought to bear on how women experience the world, and primarily through victimization. I think most would be staggered at the data around what men actually experience, but they don't want to hear it because they don't have to hear it. And they can live in a world where they don't have to, and they can function quite well. As a matter of fact, they are incentivized to go further, not hearing this. Hearing this disrupts their whole worldview. So the first response is to reject it, to dismiss it, to blame the author or the speaker and find fault in how he did it, or she, what they didn't take into account properly, or how they didn't center women well enough. Yeah, these are all knee-jerk reactions. When I put up data around maternal mortality, right? Women that were dying because they were in the group that, and you guys can see this on my community page if you haven't looked at it. There's a chart that I posted. And basically what it showed was that Black women over 40 were dying in the highest numbers due to childbirth. And the question I asked was, and I'm paraphrasing, on top of the other things that are used to explain these differences, I just asked the question to the people reading: is it possible that our culture of telling women to wait till older ages may contribute to maternal mortality? Right away, I had a simp jump in there with his cape on. How dare you ask this question? This is ridiculous. This just dismisses so much data about this. And how dare you find these monocausal, reasons for this? This is ridiculous. I didn't say it was a monocausal reason. I asked the question, does this contribute? And he said, well, culture doesn't have anything to do with it. There's so many other more material factors. I said, culture is an aspect of this, though. Because in the West, waiting till older ages to have babies has become a cultural practice. It is accepted in a lot of different circles. But in the Black community, we find it fairly well ensconced. Grandmothers and mothers are teaching their daughters. Wait till your mid-30s. Hell, wait till your 40s. I've never heard a community that has so many 40-plus-year-old women talking about when they're going to have babies for the first time. I ain't never seen it before. I've known women 2 years into, oh goodness, what's it called? What is it called? Damn it. It just escaped. It was right in my head a second ago. Menopause. 2 years into menopause, talking about, well, maybe next year I'll have a baby. 50-something years old, a couple of years into menopause, still talking about having babies. That's not a product of culture. We basically, in 2 generations, told women that family was irrelevant. I mean, mind you, they may have a couple kids up to a certain point, but when they still conceptualize marriage with kids in a formal kind of family setting, many still want that, but they're still waiting to get careers together. And I'm not even judging that. Do that, do it. If you're happy about it, great. You like it, I love it. I don't have a problem with it. I just asked the question, does this contribute to the maternal mortality rate? And between feminists who were incensed that men could have a conversation about women's bodies and super simps that had to jump in with cape on to defend something that wasn't even being argued, we couldn't even get to the base question. And here's the thing. You're talking to someone whose wife passed due to this. That's why she died. She was pregnant. And when we lost the baby, her body couldn't recoup. She died 2 months later. It took longer. It's not the traditional story where she died in the hospital right then. No, she was only a couple months pregnant. So I can't ask a question about something that directly relates to the fact that my household and family has been permanently impacted by this very issue. But no, you can't. You're not allowed to do it. And to that, I say this is bullshit. But anyway, that's it. I hope you guys got something out of it. I look forward to reading the comments. I apologize about not being savvy enough to keep up like some of the more senior content creators. Grade I9, appreciate that support. Thank you very much. Again, you can still support the show even after we're off the air. But I really want you to tell your stories in the comment sections, whether you're talking about intimate partner violence, whether you're talking about intimate partner homicide, whether you're talking about maternal mortality, anything related to the show. I want to hear your opinion. You know, there's nothing in this that I'm saying is definitive for all cases by any measure. Mostly what I'm doing is trying to make the argument that men have a place in these discussions that exists outside of feminist imaginings of what men's place should be. And men need to be the one to articulate what that is. Because ain't nobody bothered to listen till now. So for you or anybody else to tell men what their experiences are and their contributions are and what they know and what they don't know is ludicrous. So let men actually do it. And hopefully you'll be willing to even listen. But anyway, y'all have a good one. I will talk to y'all soon. Peace.